What's up, world? Hey, it's me, Lamar Moore for Lamar Media Versatility. And guess what? We ready for 2023, y'all. We ready to be booked for your event, to document, bring those memories to life, and make them everlasting. And guess what else you ready for? To bring you the experience with our booths, the experience with the fun times, and the energy, that positive energy, that energy that just keeps going and going. So remember, book us for 2023. We're here to document and provide an experience for your events. Peace.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests of Colorful Voices of Sisterhood are their own and do not represent Lamar Media Versatility, that of any broadcast networks utilized, its advertisers, or sponsors. All content is subject to copyright and may not be reproduced in any form without prior written consent by Lamar Media Versatility. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests of Colorful Voices of Sisterhood are for general public information and entertainment purposes only.
I'm Jerry Ensminger. I served in the United States Marine Corps for 24 years, some of that time at Camp Lejeune and some as a drill instructor at Parris Island. I'm here because my late daughter Janie was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 6. She suffered for nearly 2.5 years because she was exposed to toxic chemicals in the water at Camp Lejeune. Mike, Aaron Brockovich, and I fought the Corps to get recognition and justice. We are still fighting. Join me, join us in fighting for justice for Camp Lejeune victims. I relish being a drill instructor, the thrill of getting 72 new recruits to march in formation so 72 footsteps sounded like one. I took that energy and that focus into fighting the Marine Corps to get them to recognize what they did. For many years, I used to say we, Camp Lejeune Marines, were the few, the proud, the forgotten. The way it seemed to us is that the Marine Corps was saying Semper Fi, now go away and die. Well, we didn't go away. We stood our ground and fought, and we left no one behind. This victory that we secured, me, Mike, Aaron, and so many others, means that now we can get justice. It means that we can band together, all of us who were exposed to the toxic poisoning at Camp Lejeune. We can march together in one voice. We can send a message that this should never happen again. We joined this firm because we trust them. They'll fight to get results as hard as we fought to hold the Marine Corps accountable. And they listen, something that not every lawyer is good at. I know Michael and Alicia, and I know they'll fight hard to get people like us the justice we deserve. I think if you get to know them, you'll agree. I knew pretty much the first time I met a new recruit whether they would make it as a Marine, just by looking them in the eye. So come to a town hall meeting and look us in the eye. Size us up. Take our measure. See what we're made of. If you don't like what you see, no problem. But if you think we can fight for you the way we fought the Marine Corps, then join our team.
Welcome back to Colorful Voices of Sisterhood. Today we have two distinguished guests, and we're glad to have them on the show. I know you guys have been hearing a lot about the water contamination, and some of you said we're tired of hearing about it, but we actually have the person here today that have been directly impacted with the water contamination. So we want to welcome Jerry Inseminger and Mike Partain today to actually tell their story about what they've been through that was directly impacted in their life. First of all, we want to thank them all for joining in for Colorful Voices. So you guys, you have the floor now and you can start talking.
Well, I guess I better lead off because Mike didn't come in on this until 10 years after I started it. So it was August of 1997. I had retired in July of 1994. And I had retired and was living on my farm in Jones County. And I don't know why I was in the house that day, but I had fixed a plate of spaghetti and was walking into the living room to watch the evening news. Whenever I walked into the living room, the reporter that was on the TV screen said that the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which we all know as ATSDR, had released their public health assessment for the Superfund site that we all know as Camp Lejeune. And that public health assessment, they went on to say that ATSDR wanted to do further studies on children who had been conceived, carried, or born while the parents were living on base housing on Camp Lejeune. And they went on to say that ATSDR wanted to do further studies on those children for birth defects and childhood cancers, primarily leukemia. Well, I dropped my plate of spaghetti on the living room floor because my daughter Janie, who was the only one of my four daughters to have been conceived, carried, or born while we lived on base in base housing, contracted leukemia in 1983 and died in 1985. And for a parent who has a child who is diagnosed with a long-term catastrophic illness, the first response is shock. And then after the shock starts to wear off, then you're involved in the hustle and bustle of getting that child to a treatment facility where they can be treated and hopefully cured. And it wasn't until I had a chance to get past all that I had the opportunity to think and have that nagging question of why. Why did this happen to my child? And that's a question that most people never really think they're going to get an answer to. And I was no exception. And that was in July of 1983. And until I heard that TV report in August of 1997, I didn't think I'd ever get a glimmer of hope of getting that answer. But that day, when I heard that report on the news, I got that glimmer of hope. And that whole evening, it was in the summer, so the sun didn't set till later. And all my thoughts were consumed with Janie and what she had gone through, the hell she went through, and all of us that cared about her went through. And that evening, I walked out of the house and I walked down through the fields on my farm. I got down to the end of the fields where the woods started, and it was a beautiful evening. There's no light pollution out there. The stars, you could almost, it feels like you could just reach up and touch them. I got down to where the woods started, and I turned around to start back up to the house, and it was like somebody hit me over the head with a 2x4. I actually went down on my knees, and I thought, oh my God. Here I was thinking about Janie all that time, and then the thought came over me, what about all those other Marines and their families that had served at Camp Lejeune, who did maybe 1 or 2 enlistments, which about over 87% of the people that join the Marine Corps do 1 enlistment and they get out and go back home. They were never going to get that glimmer of hope. Those people that were still out there had that nagging question of what happened to me or what happened to my loved one. They were never going to get this glimmer of hope that I got from that news report. Because, let's face it, I was in the TV market for Jacksonville, Camp Lejeune, and that's the only reason I heard that report. Because all these other people that were from Louisville, Kentucky, or Richmond, Virginia, or Philadelphia, New York City, Rochester, New York, all over the country, that wasn't a news item. It was a news item here. That's why I heard it. So that put me on my mission, and I felt I owed, and the Marine Corps owed them an answer to at least alert them. And that was August of '97. And for 7 years, I got involved with Tom Townsend, who's a retired major in Moscow, Idaho. And Tom had lost a son that had been born while he and his wife lived in Paradise Point housing back in the 60s. And his little boy lived for like a little over 100 days before he died. And Tom was an avid writer. He didn't like computers. He did everything by hand. That man wrote over 1,000 Freedom of Information Act requests. Wow. Over 1,000 by hand. And he printed them on yellow legal notebook paper. And Tom's efforts, and I wrote a few FOIAs myself, but our efforts finally started to bear fruit. I mean, and the only media coverage we had back at that time was local TV stations, local radio stations, local print media. And we went on like that until it was September of 2003. And we had contacted the Washington Post, and we never got a real response from them. And it was September of 1993. I was in the house that evening. It was after 8 o'clock. And my phone rang. And I looked at the caller ID. And it was a 202 area code. So I knew it was Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. So I picked the phone up. And it was the main office of the Washington Post. And they said that they had their bureau chief on the Outer Banks covering the damage that Hurricane Isabel had done to the Outer Banks that year. And it was right after it hit. So they said that their Miami bureau chief was on the Outer Banks. He was going to try to get off of all the bridges were closed to the Outer Banks. And they were using ferries to get back and forth. Mm-hmm. He was going to try to get off of the Outer Banks on the last ferry that night. And if he was successful, they wanted to know if it would be all right for him to call me. They said it was going to be late. I said, absolutely. So it was 11:20. My phone rang. I looked at it, 202 area code. It was Manuel Roig Franzia. He was the bureau chief of their then Miami bureau. They don't have one there now anymore. And he said, he talked to me, and I set up a place for us to meet, and it was at the Kettle breakfast restaurant. the next morning. So I got there early, laid out a bunch of the documents on the table, and I sat there and waited. And I saw this guy walk in. He had a ball cap on and a leather satchel over his shoulder, and he had a camera case. And I figured, well, that's him. And it was. I stood up, and he came walking over. We introduced ourselves. And I reached over on the table and picked up a document, and I handed it to him. And he said, oh my, he goes, is this Janie's death certificate? And I said, yeah, it is. I said, look at the date. He showed up to do that interview on the anniversary of Janie's death.
Wow.
24th of September. Very emotional day for me. I had not been back on the base for a long time, and I took him to the house that Janie was conceived in was still there at that time.
On base.
Yeah, and I took him all over the base. And then, that day was over. He left, and we waited and waited and waited, and nothing. It didn't get published. And then on the 28th of January 2004, it hit the paper. It took up the whole third page of the Washington Post. And, here we were beating ourselves up thinking, we're never going to get this. We're never going to get this. Why are we having to wait so long? It was really beneficial that we did wait that long. Mm-hmm. Because when that ran in the paper, Congressman John Dingell, who was the ranking member at that time of the Energy and Commerce Committee, on the Democratic side, the Republicans controlled the House at that time. So Dingell, DOD had come in and was requesting more environmental regulations. And the chairman of the committee was about to release that over to the House Armed Services Committee, which would have meant that they would have automatically got those immunities. And Dingell forced it into a hearing. And they saw that article, and they were looking for witnesses to come and testify at that hearing. And it was a full committee hearing, the Energy and Commerce Committee. And I got a phone call from John Dingell's scheduler. Well, I didn't know who that John Dingell was. She said, she said, well, Mr. Dingell would like to meet with you. I said, about what? And she goes, about the water contamination at Camp Lejeune. Well, we had been looking for a toehold.
Mm-hmm. Anything to get in.
Yeah, and I said, oh, absolutely. So, I agreed to meet with him. She gave me the date and the time and all that. When I got off the phone with her, I called my sister, who had her own public relations firm in York, Pennsylvania. My sister Marie. And I said, hey, Marie, I said, who the hell's John Dingell? and she goes, oh my God, why? I said, he wants to meet with me about this water contamination. She goes, Jerry, she said, John Dingell is one of the founding fathers of the EPA. And she says, he is the founding father of ATSDR. I said, wow, no kidding. No, okay. So we went to this meeting. She rode the train down to Union Station and met me over there in the Rayburn House office building. We went into the meeting and we sat there and we talked for a little while. Showed him some pictures of Janie and some of the documents that we had acquired by that time. And all of a sudden he goes, all right, meeting's over. You can leave. And so we got up, walked out of his office out into the hallway, and I looked at my sister. I said, what the hell was that? Marie said, I don't know. So anyhow, to make a long story short, she left and went home. I got in my truck and drove back to North Carolina, back to my farm. And the next day, my phone rang, and it was his general counsel for the Energy and Commerce Committee, Dick Franzen. he said, Mr. Ensminger, he said, we would like to know if you would consider being a witness at a hearing that we're having on the 21st of April to try to defeat the Department of Defense's attempts to get more environmental immunities. I said, yeah, sure. He said, all right. He said, get your testimony roughed out and get it to me, and I'll work with you on it. I said, sure thing. Then it struck me after I hung the phone up what that meeting was. It was basically a job interview to see if I could string two sentences together if I wasn't wearing bib overalls, you know, had my teeth, you know.
And who is this Jerry?
Yeah. So, and then I testified at that hearing, and my testimony alone pulled 14 votes from the Republican side, and DOD's immunity attempts from further environmental regulations were defeated. So, and then Mr. Dingell, showing his appreciation, forced ATSDR to create an expert panel, and that expert panel made the recommendation to form the Camp Lejeune Community Assistance Panel. People in the audience don't realize what that community assistance panel achieved, because we forced ATSDR to do way above and beyond what they were really wanting to do with the Lejeune thing. They just wanted to smooth it over and get out of it. Well, and then that cap lasted for 15 years.
15 years.
Yeah, still here too.
Yeah.
And then the Democrats won back control of the House on the midterm elections of 2006. And then Bart Stupak was a member of the Democratic side on the Energy and Commerce Committee. He became the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee's Oversight Subcommittee. And he held a hearing in 2007. And I testified at that. And it was titled Poison Patriots. And then, you know, now let's open the curtain, and that's where Mike Partain makes his entrance. So take it over, Mike.
Okay. Well, and like Jerry said, I mean, that's when I was diagnosed with cancer, that was 10 years after Jerry had first gotten started on this. And, you know, our family, we're a Marine family. My grandfather was a career Marine. He retired as a major. My mother and father met at the Naval Academy when my dad was a midshipman, and were married there. And in April of 1967, Dad was transferred over to Camp Lejeune. And he taught the radio school there, and shortly after my parents arrived, I was conceived and then carried aboard the base and then born there in January of 1968. And anyways, you know, for most of my life, Camp Lejeune really meant nothing. My father deployed to Vietnam in May '68. We left the base. He did a tour at the Pentagon and following his deployment to Vietnam. And when he was due to rotate back to Lejeune, my mother said no. And she didn't want to go. She had this thing. She just did not like Camp Lejeune, or Lejeune, as my mother would say. My mother's from Quebec, so for most of my life, that's the only thing I heard until recently when they started promoting the correct pronunciation of Camp Lejeune. But to me, it's still Camp Lejeune.
Yeah, there's no R in there.
Yeah. But anyways, like I said, my mother is the only one that had Lejeune in it, and she always said it funny. We laughed when I was little. But anyways, my father resigned his commission, and we moved to Florida. And my hometown's Winter Haven, Florida. It's not Camp Lejeune, even though I was born here. And I never set foot back aboard the base again until 2009. But, you know, grew up in Florida, you know, went to high school, went to college, got married, had 4 kids. And one night, my then wife gave me a hug and felt a bump in my chest when I was 39 years old. And the bump didn't go away. She insisted I go see the doctor, which begrudgingly I did. And the doctor looked at it and was kind of curious and just saw the expression on his face that didn't look right. And he says, I need to send you for a mammogram. And I'm like, what? And he goes, yeah, you need a mammogram. I don't know what this is, and it's in your breast area. So I'm like, well, can men even do a mammogram? I don't have breasts. And he's like, yes, they can, and you're going to get one. So they scheduled me 2 days later on a Friday to have a mammogram, and I went to the facility. And of course, they gave me, I sat down and everything's pink and flowers, and actually sat in the waiting area for about 30, 40 minutes before they figured out that my wife is not the one getting the mammogram, it was me. And they finally called me back, and they apologized, and they told me that they thought it was my wife. So they give me a pink smock, and I'm like, I don't need this. And they brought me up and did the mammogram, and they told me to sit back down, so I'm waiting in the room, and about 5-10 minutes later, the nurse comes back in, and she has this look on her face, and I could tell something wasn't right. And she asked me if I could stay because the radiologist was on her way into the facility, and they wanted to do a sonogram on me. So I'm like, sure, I can stay, and about 15 minutes later, they brought me in and sat me down and did a sonogram of my breast, kind of the same thing you do for an ultrasound for looking at a baby. And I remember looking over at the monitor, and my hobby is astronomy. I like to look at the stars. I got a big telescope, and we look at galaxies and things called globular clusters, which they look like a giant disco ball in space. And it struck me because when I looked at the screen, I saw a bunch of white dots all clustered together in the center. It looked like a disco ball. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of odd. And at the time, I didn't know it, but what I was looking at was called microcalcifications, which are the telltale signs of cancer. And the doctor told me that they were concerned and the cancer word kind of came up, but really didn't get into a lot of it. And she said, you need to have a biopsy. And I'm like, what do you mean? And she said, well, they need to take tissue samples, see what's going on. So they scheduled me with a biopsy that following Monday. So I had to go home and wait the weekend. And came back that Monday, had my biopsy, and they took a harpoon probably about that long and jabbed it in there and took out a piece of tissue. And they scheduled me to come back 2 days later, which was my then wedding anniversary. And we sat down with my wife, and the doctor came in. When I was in college years back, I had been in a robbery where a gang broke into the restaurant that I was working at and put a gun to my head and beat the manager in front of me. I was pretty scared then. And I remember looking over and seeing the gun and looking in the chamber and saying, yeah, those are hollow points. And they decide to shoot me, I'm gone. And but I tell you, there's nothing more frightening than when you're sitting down and the doctor walks in and goes, you have cancer. And it's serious. That probably is the most terrifying moment of my life. And, they went through this thing, I was stunned, and it didn't hit me for a couple hours that, I was in a fight for my life. And they said, oh, we got to do surgery. The doctor explained that they're going to do what's called a right radical mastectomy, where they start here at the center of my chest, and they basically peeled back my chest to underneath my armpit and removed my chest tissue, or the breast tissue for that, and that I was going to have to undergo chemotherapy. And depending on the surgery results, they may have to do radiation. And this is all swirling in my head. At the time, I got 4 kids from ages 7 to 17, and we went home that night. I couldn't sleep. They had scheduled my surgery for late May. This was April 25th when I was diagnosed. And I didn't sleep for days. And I finally called the doctor and begged them to move the surgery up, and they moved it up to the first week of May. Mm-hmm. And anyways, we went through the surgery. The doctor told me that when I wake up that he'd be standing next to me and he would tell me whether or not he got all the cancer or it had spread, because there's no way to tell until they get in there. Mm-hmm. And when I woke, he told me that he got all the cancer. So, I had to go to the follow-ups because with all the damage to the tissue and everything, you get drain and stuff like that. So I had to have fluid removed from my chest every 3 days or so. And in early June, I was at one of these appointments, and I was coming out of the doctor's office, and I got a phone call from my father. And I answered the phone, and he's like, where are you? And I said, I'm at the doctor's office. He says, well, you need to get your butt home and turn CNN on right now. And I'm like, well, what's going on? He goes, just go home, turn on CNN, it's about Camp Lejeune. So I got home, and it was at the top of the hour. I flicked on the TV and, saw Jerry. And he was, they were playing footage of him testifying about how the children who were born, that they were studying the children who were born at Camp Lejeune between January 1968 and December of 1985 for their their effects due to their exposures to the contaminated water at Camp Lejeune. I'm one of those babies, and I about passed out. I mean, it just totally floored me. And I reached out to Jerry through Congressman Stupak's office. They wouldn't give me his number, but they told him that they would pass my information over to him. And I think it was the next day he called me, and we talked. And I was the first person. He hadn't heard of male breast cancer either, and I was the first person to show up with male breast cancer from Camp Lejeune. About a month after that, there was a story in my local paper that went on the internet about me. It's called "The Florida Man Has Breast Cancer," and it talked about Camp Lejeune. And about 2 weeks after that story hit, I received a call from a guy in Montgomery, Alabama, who had been a child at Camp Lejeune and actually lived in Terra Terrace, where we lived at the time I was born. And he told me that he had been diagnosed with male breast cancer 2 years before. His name was Chris Thomas, and he was the second. To date, we have over 125 men that share the unique commonality of male breast cancer and exposure to the water aboard Camp Lejeune. And one thing, quick note about breast cancer, male breast cancer. Female breast cancer we see a lot of that from Lejeune as well. Unfortunately, I call it the scourge of our time because it's so rampant in women. And I think the statistics are women can expect a 1 in 8 chance in their lifetime to see of breast cancer in their lifetime. Male breast cancer, the odds are a lot more, and it's like 1 in 2,000 or something like that. It's 0.005% chance in the general population. And typically, male breast cancer strikes men that are 70 years of age or older who have the BRCA1 or 2 gene. And I have none of those. I was 39 when I was diagnosed. I don't drink, I don't smoke, and there's no breast cancer history in my family anywhere. But yet, I have this rare condition. So, got involved with Jerry. We, teamed up with him. My degree's in history, and I was a claims adjuster with State Farm and USAA. I did put together the historical information that Tom had got together and all the FOIA requests and started to organize the documents. And we worked on a timeline of events. It's like 55 pages long that details the extent of the contamination, what they knew, when they knew it, what they did, and what they didn't do. And then we took that to Congress. And between 2009 and 2012, when we got our first legislative victory, we flipped the narrative. Because before, when I first started, and Jerry scolded me my first trip up to D.C., he's like, quit panicking. And I remember going up there, and I was all excited. It was my first time in Washington. I'd never been involved in politics. It was January 2009. And we went to a meeting with Stupak, and Congressman Stupak, and we were thinking, okay, we're going to get a follow-up hearing. We've got this new information. We have the timeline. And the meeting was over in like 15 seconds. And basically it was, look, guys, I got the hearing. We haven't got the response to justify another hearing. And pretty much when you get more information and more backing, come back and see us. And door was shut. Wow. And on the way back home, just outside D.C., Jerry's like, I can't believe this. I can't believe it. Jerry goes, shut up. He goes, I've been doing this for 10 years or 12 years at the time, and, it will come out. Don't panic. And he still reminds me of that today. And he was right. We one of the first big victories we got when, Jerry was talking about ATSDR, there was a public health assessment how Jerry found out about Camp Lejeune. And that public health assessment was released in 1997. The ATSDR stood by it, and it had one glaring error, that there was no exposures to benzene in our drinking water. After that meeting with Stupak, we found evidence that that there was fuel, specifically benzene, in the drinking water of Camp Lejeune. And then we turned that evidence to Congress and created pressure that in April of 2009, for the first time in the agency's history, they withdrew the actual public health assessment for Camp Lejeune. And it rescinded it and revised it. It took them 7 years to revise the public health assessment, and it was re-released in 2016.
And that brings me up to another point. This myth that has been propagated by a lot of the local media and even some of the national media, is that ABC dry cleaners are the ones that were responsible for all the contamination on Camp Lejeune. That is bull crap, okay? 100%. ABC Dry Cleaners was only responsible for the contamination that affected Terrawit Terrace. That's all.
That's good.
Because you've got Northeast Creek between ABC Dry Cleaners and Terrawit Terrace. And you got Terrawit Terrace, ABC Dry Cleaners, and you got Northeast Creek that separates them from the main part of the base.
And we still hear that in the news. As recently as a couple weeks ago, a major news source, Fox News, said in their broadcast that the contamination was due to an off-base dry cleaners. And here we are, 25 years into this, and that myth or legend, I call it, still persists to this day. And it does a great deal of...
And, we still hear people making comments about, well, it was ABC Dry Cleaners that contaminated Terrawit Terrace. That wasn't the Marine Corps or the Department of Navy's fault. Yes, it was. From one point forward. The Navy had their own regulations pertaining to drinking water systems. The wells for Terrawit Terrace were on the virtual property line. They were positioned between the railroad tracks that ran up along there and Lejeune Boulevard. They didn't control what happened on the property that was less than 20 yards from their wells. Wow. And they couldn't move the wells further down into the housing area because all the water that surrounded Terrawit Terrace on one side was all brackish water. It had salt water in it. That would have, you can't use it.
Right.
Now, Jerry talks about the...
And we were down gradient of all those contamination sources across the road from the well field for Terrawit Terrace.
Wow.
Now, Jerry talks about the Navy's potable water regulations. These regulations date back to 1963. They're light years ahead of the Safe Drinking Water Act and even the standards that are today. Matter of fact, in December of 1988, the Navy changed their potable water regulations and rescinded these orders and turned it over to the Safe Drinking Water Act, so they follow that now. But one thing, when Jerry's talking about location, these regulations are very detailed. They have definitions in them. And one of these definitions, I'll read two real quick, and this is the case in point of what Jerry's talking about. In these regulations, it says health hazards is defined as means any condition, devices, or practices in the water supply system and its operation which create or may create a danger to the health and well-being of the water consumer. An example of a health hazard is a structural defect in the water supply system, which wells are considered part of that, and that's defined in there too. Whether of location, design, or construction which may regularly or occasionally prevent satisfactory purification of the water supply or cause it to be polluted from extraneous sources. And then they go on to define pollution. Because when you look at the Navy's permutations and the Marine Corps' permutations of what regulations they were following, because throughout this period they said, well, we weren't violating any EPA drinking water regulations, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and they changed it, government regulations and what have you, but they've never addressed these. Now, pollution as used in these standards means the presence of any foreign substance, organic or inorganic, radiological or biological, in water which tends to degrade the quality of the water to constitute a hazard or impair its usefulness of the water.
Wow.
I mean, it's right there in black and white.
These
I got a couple
regulations.
questions that came up on this right here. So one says, how long have this case been open, and has anyone came forward to help? That's one question. And has anyone received compensation from the water contamination, or is it an ongoing battle?
Well, that last question was no. Nobody has received compensation yet, and that's playing itself out now.
Okay.
Well,
and prior to that, we had all kinds of people come forward, members of Congress, the Senate that assisted Mike and I in our fight, and some other victims. But for the most part, most people didn't commit the effort that Mike and Tom and I and a few others did. I mean, it was basically us that did all the
groundwork.
Yeah.
Well, one thing is our community is fractured. Camp Lejeune's here in North Carolina. I remember when I first tried to bring Camp Lejeune up in Florida, that's a North Carolina issue. And the problem is you can't drive aboard the base and you can't, a reporter can't go down the road and say, well, that's where Jenny was born, that's where Mike was born, and they had cancer and what have you. And even if they could, these families are not there. They went back to their small town America where they came from. Mm-hmm. And, so trying to get the story outside Jacksonville, North Carolina was a struggle. And our community, most of our community is located across the country. Florida, for example, is the second highest state behind North Carolina with registrants from Camp Lejeune. Now, on the compensation question and everything.
For the water.
Yeah, for the water.
Mm-hmm.
There are, when you talk about compensation, the lawsuits that are originating because of the new law that was passed in August, nothing's been settled, and that's probably the most frequent question we get. Nothing's happened. Matter of fact, it's just a big log jam right now. And our Facebook site, the Camp Lejeune Toxic Water Survivors, we have a campaign going out encouraging people to write their senators and their congressmen, trying to get pressure on DOJ and the Department of the Navy to start moving on these claims. And because according to Judge Dever, at a hearing on April 5th, if these claims go through the courtrooms, we're going to be here as long as the Roman Empire, trying to get this thing settled. But there are presumptive service connections. It's actually the largest presumptive service connection since Vietnam that was established through the efforts of the CAP and Jerry and I. You get leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, kidney cancer, bladder cancer are some of the conditions that if you show that you were Marine or Navy and you were aboard Lejeune during the contamination period, and you have a diagnosis, then it's presumed that you're connected, and you can get disability, you can get health benefits, and what have you. And then also the Janie Insminger Act that was passed in 2012, named after Janie, has healthcare as a last resort for 15 conditions for both the dependents and for the Marines. But of course, that we've got the Camp Lejeune Justice Act that was passed in August 2022.
But the fight continues on.
Oh, yes.
There was another, it says, it bothers me that so many years has passed and the water is still contaminated. What is so hard about cleaning up the water and saving the health and lives of people they serve to protect us? And what about the drinking water in Jacksonville? So many people are afraid to drink this water.
Well, I know Jerry was on the RAB, so he can give more detail on the water and everything, but the contamination aboard the base, when you look at the hydrological gradient, is towards the ocean and towards the New River. So that contamination that occurred aboard the base did not backflow into Jacksonville.
Okay.
Now, Terra Terrace, because it was down gradient of ABC dry cleaners, and then when you add the wells that were up along Lejeune Boulevard, specifically well TT26, that drew the contamination into Terra Terrace and into that well system.
Well, no, it was down gradient.
Yeah. What drew it in two more. So.
And some people getting false information that money is already being paid out.
No, none.
So you got to realize that is a scam when you hear that, because nothing has been paid out.
No.
Well, and a lot of that's coming in. I've gotten these texts too as well, where you'll get a text out of blue saying, "Oh, your Camp Lejeune settlement's prepared. All you need to do is call this number here, and you're going to be a millionaire."
Yeah.
Those are scams. If you get unsolicited texts from an attorney, or they're not. A lot of these firms are not even attorneys; they're fronts. Where they're trying to accumulate people to turn over to an attorney, but or just trying to swindle you, kind of like the Nigerian prince email that you get, that if you send money here, put it in the bank account and you get more money back.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, our community has been victimized again.
Yes.
And I would encourage people to get texts like that or unsolicited emails. Don't even open them, because there's malware that's involved in there, and you click it, they can get into your computer. Just ignore it. If you have legal questions about Lejeune and stuff, consult an attorney.
Yeah.
Now, the attorneys that Jerry and I represented are Camp Lejeune Legal, Henson First, and Michael Watts. We actually have an office here in
CampLegionelegal.com.
Yeah, CampLegionelegal.com. Henson First is the local representative here, and there's an office over on Gum Branch Road. next to the food line.
It's
Yeah.
2200 Suite G, Gum Branch Road. It's directly across from Williamsburg Plantation Housing Development. As a matter of fact, where the shopping plaza is, where our office is located, is called Williamsburg Crossing. And it's at the corner of Western Boulevard Extension and Gum Branch Road.
Now, Jerry's talking about, or Dinah had the question about the settlements and everything. The first administrative hearing, it was a case management conference, occurred on April 5th in Raleigh. Jerry and I were actually in the gallery during the hearing procedures. One of the first question that the judge asked the defense counsel was basically how long the Roman Empire lasted. And then that went into a discussion, and then he said, Mr. Bain, who is the lead attorney for the government, said, how many claims have been settled by the Department of the Navy since the bill was signed? Because a lot of people don't realize that with this legislation, before you can file suit, you have to file an administrative claim with the Department of the Navy. And the intent is to get those settled. Basically, Mr. Bain replied back that none had been settled. And then he asked a follow-up question, how many cases have been offered for settlement? And the answer was none. And here we are almost, 9 months since the bill was passed, and we're still at the same place. The needle has not moved past zero.
That's why people that are out there listening and people who view this and listen to it, you have elected members of Congress that are supposed to be representing you. You have 2 United States senators in each state, and then you have a the member of the House of Representatives that represents you in Congress for your district. You write to those people. If you don't get a decent response from them, go to their office and tell them, hey, this thing passed Congress on a,
86-11.
yeah. I mean, and this foot dragging is not within the intent that Congress and then the president signed this into law. They need to get on the stick.
Matter of fact, my senator just wrote a letter to the Department of the Navy today. They released it today. Because we're putting pressure, and our government system does work, but you have to engage it. And if you sit back and do nothing and don't call your U.S. senators or your congressmen and start, asking why and holding their feet to the fire, nothing's going to happen.
Right.
And by the way, all this crap about ABC Dry Cleaners was responsible for all the contamination on the base, which is, we've already laid out, that's a lie, all right? The worst contaminated water system aboard Camp Lejeune, by far, was the Hadnot Point drinking water system. And that's where the most people were exposed.
Okay, I used to work there.
Yeah. Because the Hadnot Point
It
system
was
served,
horrible.
it served the barracks, the Naval Hospital, and before 1972, it served the whole side of the base. To give you an idea how bad some of the contamination is, we found in the documents that the Hadnot Point fuel farm, over the operational life of the fuel farm from 1942 to 1991, lost an approximate 1.5 million gallons of fuel into the aquifer at the Hadnot Point industrial area. They had a layer of pure product floating in the aquifer that was
shallow
15,
aquifer.
the shallow aquifer, that was 15 feet thick.
Yeah, I refer to that as, I jokingly refer to that as the Camp Lejeune Strategic Fuel Reserve.
I got one other question, and we may have answered this. How receptive have legislative officials been in endorsing and pushing for awareness for this case? How involved have they been?
It's been, some of them were really great, and other ones not at all. I mean, it's whatever their whim is, whatever their focus is on is what they do. I mean, and
Yeah, we've engaged, probably over a dozen senators over the course of this. This has been a dogfight. 25 years for Jerry, 16 for me now, and I've gone through a couple senators myself in Florida. Jerry's gone through a couple, more than a couple here in North Carolina. But if you engage them and you bring them the facts, you bring them the documents, and you say, "Here's what's going on," they'll do the right thing. I mean, our government system does work when you properly apply it.
Well, and you gotta expend the shoe leather, and you gotta force them to do it. And, just to let people know how the notification came about. You watch the award-winning documentary, Semper Fi, Always Faithful. Congressman Stupak, in that one hearing, it's part of that documentary. He says, "I just can't believe that you can't locate these people and notify them." And I was in a meeting with Elizabeth Dole when she was still a senator, before Kay Hagan won and took that seat. Senator Dole sat right there and told me, "Oh, Jerry," she said, "there's no way that we could, locate all of these Marines in their, and I said, "Senator, are you telling me that if I owed the federal government money, that the IRS wouldn't be able to track me down?" And she said, "Oh my God, that's a great idea." That's how the IRS got involved in notifying former Marines about the water contamination.
And we're still trying to locate people.
And I was just doing it as a
Yeah.
a kickback at her, but she took
worked.
it and it worked.
Yeah, that works. But people that have worked aboard base, whether military, civilian, contractors, we're still looking for those people.
Yeah, sure.
Am I correct?
Yeah.
So they can, file claims if they have these illness that we're looking for. We're still trying to find and locate these people for it, so they can put in their claim for it. Because you guys fought real hard for this.
Well, yeah. I mean, there were a lot of civilian government service employees that commuted to Camp Lejeune because back in the day, these were the best paying jobs in the area.
Yes.
And they came all the way from Burgall.
Rose
They
Hill.
came Wallace.
Yes.
Kinston.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm aware that a lot of them are dead.
But their families can file on their behalf. Am I correct?
Yeah, open estate.
So they can open an estate and file on behalf of the parents or the deceased person. So there's still hope, even they're gone.
And there was a recent article that came out last week with a scientific finding that Parkinson's, and they cited Lejeune in the article, that the veterans at Lejeune were 70% more likely to have Parkinson's disease when compared to the veterans out of Camp Pendleton. So, I mean, the science is coming. It's just taking a long time on that part. But there are 25 conditions that that I know the epidemiologists that Jerry and I work with have been able to say, yes, these are caused by Camp Lejeune.
So in saying that, this is pretty much how we got the list of the different cases. So can you explain how they come up with the different? Because I know there's some attorneys take prostate cancer and everything else. So
Here's the
explain
deal.
that.
Here's the deal. Our lead attorney, Michael Watts, laid it down to Mike and I and our staff that first and foremost, you've got to prove exposure. So you would have had to have worked or lived in an area where the water was contaminated. And you have to be able to prove that. All right. Secondly, it's called causation. There has to be epidemiological evidence or medical evidence that the health effect that you suffered from has enough studies to prove that these chemicals, or lead you to believe that these chemicals cause that health effect. And, there's all kinds of people that come in and, try to sign up that, they have all these different health effects. And they're not on the list. Some of these health effects never showed up in any of the studies that had been done on communities, in the past that link these chemicals to the health effect that they're presenting.
A good example of that would be thyroid cancer. We see, and we've over the years have seen hundreds of cases of thyroid cancer. There's no connection between thyroid cancer and exposure to benzene, trichloroethylene, tetrachloroethylene, or vinyl chloride. There's nothing in the literature. There's nothing in the science, and we don't know why. And that would, with that, if someone's to bring that to court, the case would be thrown out because there is no scientific evidence connecting thyroid cancer to Camp Lejeune. However, if we find that, one of the things we do is, review with the epidemiologist. If we find that connection, then they'll add that list. Mm-hmm. And you can go to CampLegeuneLegal.com and the facts FAQ section. It has the conditions. There's an entry that has the 25 conditions that are accepted. And like Diana's saying, there are different law firms that accept different stuff, but the fact of the matter is you got to be able to prove it.
There's one other thing that people need to understand too when they're going out and looking for a law firm or somebody to represent them. Be careful. You need to look at everything that these people are or are not talking about. What percentage of their settlement are these people going to take from you? And then what are the add-ons to it after they take that? All right, say somebody says, okay, in your contract, we're going to take 40% of your settlement. Well, number one, that's greed. Mm-hmm. All right, number two, that's 40% right off the top of your settlement. Then they start tacking on administrative fees and expert witness fees, and you'll be lucky to get 40% of your settlement, and they're going to end up with 60.
Wow. Do they need lawyers? Do they have to have lawyers to get this process?
Well, if you're not happy with it, say they may come to you and they make an offer for a settlement, and it's say $5 million. Okay. Well, if say you had cancer and they're offering you $500,000 and you're not happy with that, that's when you're going to need an attorney to assist you and take this thing into court. And believe me, the government's going to have professional attorneys and they're defending them.
Yes.
So you better have somebody that's a professional helping you.
Okay. That makes
One
sense.
quick question before I know our time is running out. Thank you for advocating for this important issue. For those who want to know, how can we find the legislators in our area? I'll give you that, Mike.
Yeah, there's actually a website you can go on at Who's My Congressman, and you put your zip code in, and they'll tell you the name and link for your congressman. If you go to the Camp Lejeune Toxic Waters Survivors Facebook site, there's actually a posting where I have that on there and a form letter that you can follow to write to your congressman and your U.S. senators. I know both Senator Tillis, even though he voted against the PACT Act, and the new senator from North Carolina wrote a letter to the Department of the Navy demanding
There's
answers.
a whole group of them.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them.
Oh, and by the way, tomorrow morning we are having a free breakfast at our office over there at 2200 Gum Branch Road from 8 in the morning till 9. So come on by. Mike and I will be there. Diana will be there.
Yep. Ryan, the whole staff will be there. We hope you guys stop by tomorrow there because we do have information, and we're there willing to share what information we have because we believe that if you get the truth, you know where to go. So thank you guys for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having
We
us.
really appreciate it. Next week, we will have Shannon Jordan, and Shannon is with Lower Cape Fear Life Care, and we're going to be talking about taking the myth out of what hospice care is. Hospice care go beyond just death. So we'll be talking about that next week. So we look forward to seeing you guys next week, and happy Memorial Day and be safe. Agnes and Raquel, we do miss you today, but we'll see you back on the show next week. And again, to our guests, thank y'all for showing.
Thank you. Another question popped in.
Did I have one more question?
At Lawnmower Media Versatility, we aim to provide comprehensive solutions to our clients. We have a team of experienced professionals who can help you with every aspect of your media needs. From documentation and marketing to promotion and more, we provide our clients with top-notch quality services. We understand that each client is unique and has specific needs. That's why our team works closely with you to understand your company and event goals and objectives. We are committed to providing the highest quality services in media and strive to exceed our clients' expectations. Our team is passionate about helping you reach your goals and making sure you get the best experience and results. If you're looking for a reliable business to help you with all your media needs, look no further than Lamour Media Versatility. Contact us today to get started at 252-497-3817 or at www.lamour-photos.com.